The second part of either or, written under the pseudonyms B and the Judge, who eventually converge into a single character, takes the form of a letter written by the judge to A. The letter is a response to part 1 of either or. In it, the judge attempts to persuade A that the ethical life is better than the purely aesthetic life. He tries to persuade him over to the ethical sphere of life, characterized by a social and morally proper life. However, he does not want to lose his attention, as A will perceive it as boring. Thus, he begins with his interests, the aesthetic validity in marriage. The aesthete believes marriage is a limitation, as he enjoys the game of romantic chasing. The ethical individual, however, argues that marriage is the actual poetic love, which consists of a continual rejuvenation of one's first love. It is not a regretful backward glance at unstable romantic love, but rather a duty one must fulfill, which is a testament of romance. The judge claims that the ethical life of being married is better than the aesthetic life of the seducer, and the judge makes this claim on an aesthetic basis. The judge says that there is actually more aesthetic pleasure to be found in a consistent marriage than in a bachelor life. The judge draws a distinction between the ethical, forward looking repetition of the married life and the aesthetic, backward looking recollection of the confirmed bachelor. He further points out that romantic literature always focuses on what happens before marriage, but not what happens after, and he claims that the aesthetic fear of repetition is always actually cowardly and selfish. The judge argues that romantic love can exist in marriage and goes so far as to say that marriage is the highest form of romantic love. The ethical courage to submit to repetition is rewarded by the consistent, reliable aesthetic pleasure found in a loving marriage. In the second letter, B proposes an equilibrium between the aesthetic and the ethical. There is a difference between the either-ors presented to the aesthetic and the ethical individuals. The aesthetic individual's either-or is presented in part 1, where he says, if you marry, you will regret it. If you do not marry, you will also regret it. If you marry or if you do not marry, you will regret both. Whether you marry or you do not marry, you will regret both. Laugh at the world's follies, you will regret it. Weep over them, you will also regret it. If you laugh at the world's follies or if you weep over them, you will regret both. Whether you laugh at the world's follies or you weep over them, you will regret both. Believe a girl, you will regret it. If you do not believe her, you will also regret it. If you believe a girl or you do not believe her, you will regret both. Whether you believe a girl or do not believe her, you will regret both. If you hang yourself, you will regret it. If you do not hang yourself, you will regret it. If you hang yourself or you do not hang yourself, you will regret both. Whether you hang yourself or you do not hang yourself, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is the sum of all practical wisdom. The aesthetic individual is in constant conflict and crippled by his choices, preferring to experiment with life, escaping the moment into fantasy. His existence is devoid of personality because choice itself defines personality. The ethical individual's either-or is to choose between the aesthetic and the aesthetic or the ethical. He chooses the ethical and immerses his whole personality in what is chosen and says, I choose absolutely, and I choose absolutely precisely through having not chosen to choose this thing or that. The ethical individual who focuses on duty ends up receiving more pleasure than the aesthete, who seeks pleasure only to find unhappiness and despair. Happiness is one of those things that we're much more likely to find if we are not looking for it. The ethical individual, the judge, goes on to claim that A's devotion to the aesthetic prevents A from making any significant choices. Although A has a far wider range of options than the judge argues that since the judge's choices are limited by ethics, by consideration of other people, his choices are much weightier and mean much more to him than A's aesthetic choices mean to A. The aesthetic has its place, the judge agrees, but the place of the aesthetic is beneath the ethical. The judge's actual loving relationship with his wife is far better, the judge argues, than the largely imaginary relationship between Johannes Climacus and Cordelia. The judge experiences his pleasure with another person, while a seducer's pleasure is completely in his or her imagination. Part 2 ends with a sermon that the judge has received from a friend. The sermon is entitled, The Edification Which Lies in the Fact That in Relation to God we are always in the Wrong. The sermon's key point is that humans, whether their choices are aesthetically or ethically motivated, are never in the right. Only by accepting that God is always right and by trying to do God's will can a person escape unhappiness. Each individual can become conscious of a higher self than oneself and embrace this spiritual self in an eternal understanding. Kierkegaard was far more interested in making us think than in giving us answers. We are thus encouraged to decide for ourselves the merits of the various viewpoints presented. It is tempting but incorrect to read either or as an explanation of how one can move from the aesthetic life into the ethical. True, the pleasures of the aesthetic are solipsistic, fleeting, and unreliable, while the pleasures of the ethical are empathetic, prolonged, and constant. However, both A and the judge make good cases for the particular philosophies. A attempts to seduce the reader with his prose, just as Johannes attempts to seduce Cordelia, just as John 1 seduces women, and just as music seduces the listener. A, through his attempted seduction of the reader, is trying to lead the reader toward an appreciation of the aesthetic life. Alternatively, the judge attempts to convince the reader that the ethical life is better than the aesthetic life, and he uses reason, not seduction, to accomplish this. Each writer's rhetorical strategy appropriately reflects his values. However, a closer examination reveals inconsistencies in the positions of both A and the judge. A speaks eloquently about the value of focusing solely on personal pleasure, but in doing so, he is actually instructing the reader in how the reader might experience more aesthetic pleasure. A's apparent concern for the good of the reader is, though focused on the aesthetic, still an ethical concern, despite the fact that A makes it clear that this aesthete focuses on his or her own pleasure and not the pleasure of others or the good of others. On the other hand, the judge, in making the case for the ethical life, continually comes back to the point that the ethical life leads to even more aesthetic enjoyment than the purely aesthetic life. In the end, A and the judge are concerned with both aesthetic pleasures and the ethical duties. Something that either or is about overcoming the aesthetic life or the ethical life. However, the judge's arguments do not actually prove that this ethical life is wholly separate and better than the aesthetic life. There isn't actually an either or choice between the aesthetic and the ethical. Both are necessary. The either or choice hinted at by the title either or is actually a choice between the aesthetic or ethical life and the religious life. Either you choose the aesthetic and the ethical life, or you choose the religious life. Aesthetics and ethics can coexist, but both detract from the religious. This is why either or ends with this sermon on how, in relation to God, people are always wrong. Both A and the judge make cases for how people should act in accordance with aesthetic and ethical systems, but any system designed by a human is necessarily flawed. Kierkegaard does not explore the religious very deeply in either or, saving that for his later works, but either or demonstrates that neither the aesthetic life nor the ethical life is complete without religion. A's groundless individuality and the judge's principled marriage both interfere with the intense faith-based introspection that exemplifies the religious life. The final sermon in either or is partially an attack on Hegel, who believes that the divine is played out through the actions of society. Kierkegaard empathetically does not believe this to be the case. If the divine is played out through society, then the social, ethical life would be, as a manifestation of the divine, the best life. Kierkegaard argues that only God is in the right, and to approach God requires introspective faith. There is no system, aesthetic or ethical, that can truly lead people in the right direction. People need religion, but they need it on a personal level, not a societal level. Kierkegaard feels that beliefs like Hegel's and institutions like the church claim to provide answers to people's troubles, but in reality are simply providing excuses to avoid self-examination. Kierkegaard's use of pseudonyms in either or can be viewed as a concrete metaphor for Kierkegaard's internal confusion. In other words, although Kierkegaard wrote all of either or, he made up authors for different parts to represent different aspects of his own personality. The conflict between the aesthetic and the ethical exists, to a certain extent, in every human. There are many systems in place to help mediate this conflict, but Kierkegaard demonstrates in either or as well as some of his other works such as Stages on Life's Way, which we'll discuss in the future, that the only escape from this conflict is to take a personal approach to religion. Lastly, to understand Kierkegaard, we must tell the story of his love for Regine Olsen and the massive sacrifices he made for his art. Kierkegaard pursued Regine Olsen for 2 years before he proposed and ultimately regretted the decision he'd made. They met in the spring of 1837 while Kierkegaard was still a student. His liking for her was immediate, and he pursued her as a friend and then a suitor, but before he confessed his true feelings. Kierkegaard wrote the Either Or shortly after breaking off his engagement with her. He broke off the engagement, believing it would be torturous for Regine Olsen to be his companion because there was something spectral about him, something no one could endure who had to see him every day and have a real relationship with him. He believed that his intellectual duty to himself superseded his ethical duty to his partner, and his motivation for the break was his conception of his religious task. He dared not bind himself to anyone on earth in order to not be obstructed from his calling. He had to sacrifice the very best thing he owned in order to work as God demanded of him. Therefore, he sacrificed love for the sake of his purpose in life. He died at the age of 42, and on his deathbed, he said, "She was the one I loved. My existence must unconditionally accentuate her life. My writing should be considered a monument to her honor and memory. I carry her with me into history." He felt the engagement as binding as marriage and wanted his belongings to be given to her after his death. The influence of Regine and their short-lived affair is present throughout his works. In his book Repetition, he depicts a young man who abandons his fiancée without an explanation because he feels that God has forbidden the marriage. In this, he seems to be commenting on his very own breakup with Regine. In that book, the young man never fully becomes religious despite giving up his one true love for the sake of his relationship with God. Instead, he merely becomes a spiritual poet. In another one of his books, Fear and Trembling, published the same day, he seems to be commenting less directly on his own broken engagement, using the idea of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. In both books, the focal character is a man who gives up an ethically and religiously sanctioned relationship to another person for the sake of a personal relationship with God, who is making this unique demand on him, while at the same time expecting that God will not really demand that sacrifice be permanent, but also willing to accept if it is. This seems to be both a theological description of faith and a psychological expression of Kierkegaard's own engagement. Like Abraham offering Isaac to God, Kierkegaard describes in his journals how he gives up his engagement, yet somehow hopes that God will intervene and make it possible for him to marry Regine the same way God returned Isaac to Abraham. But at another point in his journals, Kierkegaard writes that if he really had faith, he would have stayed with Regine and allowed God to make him a fit husband while also being a Christian. He seems to have been personally confused his whole life over whether he was right to have believed that God had vetoed his marriage, or if that was his own melancholy. What we can see in Kierkegaard's earlier writings is that marriage is an ethical relationship first and foremost that takes the passion of love and adds personal commitment as a duty expressed communally. While the ethical marriage was always done in a church and a state, that alone doesn't make it religious in the strictest sense. In the strictest sense, the religious takes precedence over the ethical, and one fulfills one's ethical duties not merely because they are duties, but because God has given them as a gift and a task. In theory, God can demand that a person not marry, and that person's individual relationship to God will be completely valid. From the ethical standpoint, not marrying is a failure since the ethical is the universal and the universal ideal is marriage and family. But for most religious people, God does not demand an actual break from the ethical. They still live their ethical duties, but grounded in the relationship to God instead of the universal. This is particularly discussed in Postscript's discussion of resignation, suffering, and guilt. Resignation gives up everything for God, like Abraham giving Isaac or Kierkegaard giving Regine. Suffering realizes that the religious life is not a one-and-done sacrifice, but that every moment of existence is surrendering all of one's aesthetic joys and ethical relationships to God and receiving them again from God's hand. Guilt is realizing that even fulfilling all of these relationships is not enough because we can never do so perfectly and completely. So we always need God to forgive us, validate us, and empower us to do it again.